Brock Bowers is the tight end on everybody's lips, but is there another rookie you should be considering? I looked through 20 years of fantasy data to find out what we should expect from our newly drafted tight ends. Stick around to find out how you should value this year's rookies. Plus, I unveil my updated rookie tight end rankings on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. I release all my rankings there and I answer all your questions as well. You can also check out my rankings on our website at ffdfantasyfootball.com. I've got rookie rankings, I've got dynasty rankings, and I'm going to have IDP rankings up there very soon as well. Plus, you can check out all the articles I write over there for Razzball as well. Today, we're talking about tight ends, and it's the same as the previous 3 videos. If you haven't already, make sure you go and check out my breakdown of the quarterback, running back, and wide receiver hit rates from over the last 20 years. Let me run through the methodology real quickly. Very similar idea as the quarterbacks because tight ends do have pretty good longevity in the league, but you only get to start 12 of them. So to be a superstar, you really have to be one of the top couple of tight ends. For that reason, I've categorized our tight ends into 8 categories. The top category is superstar. You have to have at least one top 2 finish and be fantasy relevant for at least 7 years. Fantasy relevant to me means at least top 30 tight end finishes in 7 years. Now, studs are top 5 and fantasy relevant for 5 years, so on and so forth. I also have brief boom and brief value guys who are either top 5 or top 30, but don't last in the league for as long. Anyone else to me is a bust. If you're not able to maintain it for an extended period of time and you're not having those strong finishes, you're not someone I want in my fantasy team. Let's go through and check out what we should expect from this year's tight end class. Now, the biggest name, as we said, Brock Bowers. We know this guy's going to be good, but how good? Well, it's pretty rare to have a guy drafted this early as a tight end in the NFL draft. It's happened 5 times in the last 20 years. Now, a couple of those times were all the way back in 2004 and 2006 with Kellen Winslow and Vernon Davis, and they both went on to have very good careers. Vernon Davis had a top 2 finish. Winslow had a top 5 finishes, so they're both very good players. Eric Ebron wasn't as consistent, but he did have some good fantasy finishes, so he still fell into the stud categories. We know how good TJ Hawkinson's going to be, and we also have Kyle Pitts, who has that top 5 finish and is clearly going to be around for a while. Now, we don't know exactly how he's going to go this year, but he's clearly a stud in NFL fantasy. What's Bowers going to be? Well, we're talking about a receiving tight end who's a real mismatch weapon. He's going to be fantastic for fantasy, and we've seen that players drafted in this range, they always hit. Now, that's not how probability works. That doesn't mean this is a guarantee. But history suggests that if you're going to be drafted that high, teams are going to use you and teams are going to rely on you in every phase of the game. And that's a fantastic thing for fantasy. We should be expecting top 5 finishes from Brock Bowers. Now, how do you value him compared to other players? Well, for me, he's already top 2 in my dynasty tight end rankings. I'm very confident he's going to be good. Plus, he's very young, so he's going to be around for a while. He doesn't have much of an injury history, so I think you can rely on him to be a good fantasy player for the long term. The question is, how do you value him compared to the other rookies? Well, I've got him behind Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Neighbors, obviously. I think he's very close to Rome Odunze, and he's very close to Caleb Williams as well. In Superflex, he goes behind Williams and Daniels to me, and I think there's an argument to have him behind May if you really need a quarterback. But I also don't think it's entirely crazy to be taking Bowers' 3rd pick overall in a rookie draft. I think he's going to be that good. It really depends. Are you in a tight end premium league? How much do you need a tight end? Is this a position of weakness and strength? How does your league value tight ends? All those are things that you need to take into account when drafting him. But if he hasn't gone off the board in the first 5 or 6 picks, I would be doing everything in my power to trade up to go and get him because some leagues are simply not going to value him and he's going to fall. This is a fantastic opportunity for you to get an elite tight end straight away. Now, things drop off very quickly after Brock Bowers. And we knew that going into the draft. There were big question marks on who would even be the second tight end off the board. As it turned out, it was Ben Sinnott, and he went mid to late second round. Not entirely surprised that Sinnott was the second guy. Not who I personally would have picked, though. I've got a lot of issues with Sinnott, but I'll talk about that when we go into the actual rankings for my tight end rookies. Let's just talk about guys that are drafted in this range. Now, you're still talking about a pretty safe player here. Late second round tends to be safe for most positions, and the same is true for tight end, but there's less of a top end here. The only real top guys, the only guys with any top 5 fantasy finishes in the last 20 years drafted in this range, Rob Gronkowski, and obviously he's a guy you'd want, and Kyle Rudolph, who wasn't even that fantastic for fantasy. He just had 1 or 2 good years. So there really is a lack of quality. Now, arguably, guys like Trey McBride probably going to turn into a superstar or a stud based on what's been happening. I'm not convinced that he's going to be a true superstar, Trey McBride, but I do think he's got some top 5 fantasy finishes in his future. Plus, there's some other solid players. Guys like Dallas Goedert have been pretty good in fantasy as well. But there is a lack of a top end. You are not getting as many elite players in this range. It's just frankly hard to find elite tight ends. And this is not the range where you want to be finding them. You want to be drafting them earlier. Most of those guys go in the first round or early second round, as we saw last year with guys like Sam Laporta. So once we get to this point, we have to take any pick with a grain of salt. We can see that they're busting or only providing brief value half the time, and that's not very good. And I think Sinnott's likely to fall into that bust category. Now, it gets even uglier after that. This is where Tip Ryman went. And if you know anything about him, you know that this is not a play you particularly want for fantasy. It's more of a blocking tight end. And this is the sort of range where we see a lot of blocking tight ends go. This is an important position for the NFL, not an important position for fantasy. NFL teams do need a tight end who can block well and allow them to play strong 2 tight end sets or allow them to have extra guys blocking, but also be a bit of a threat to catch the ball. That's what Ryman's going to be. Now, there have been some very good tight ends drafted in this range. We're talking Travis Kelce, my favorite tight end. We're talking about Mark Andrews. Jordan Reed was fantastic for a couple of years. Plus, even now, we've also got guys like Dawson Knox and things like that who were drafted in this range. So there are some good players, but most of them aren't going to be that style of players. You're going to get a lot of Jeremy Ruckert-style guys who are blocking tight ends who we hope will turn into a pass catcher one day, and guys who are pure pass catchers who just never made it work. Jelani Woods, I guess the jury's still out on him, but guys like Hunter Long and Tommy Tremble, it's just not going to work out for him. And there are a lot of players drafted in this range who are exactly that same style of player. Guys who went as the second tight end, we took them in fantasy and we hoped it would work out, and it just plain didn't. And there are going to be a lot more guys drafted in this round and later on that are going to fall into that same category. Your chances of hitting here are pretty darn low, but it gets even uglier in the following rounds. 4th and 5th round, we had a lot more guys off the board this season. We had 6 guys off the board in the 4th round, and there's quite a bit of talent there, but the chances of hitting is scarily low. We have had players do well here. George Kittle, of course, had a top 3 fantasy finish. Dalton Schultz has been very good recently. Julius Thomas was a big name if you played fantasy back then. Tyler Higbee was solid for a while. There are some guys that were drafted here, but a lot of total players have been drafted in this range. 65 in the range I looked at just in the last 15 years. Not many of them hit. So the chances of one of these guys hitting is pretty low. Having said that, I think one of them at least probably will. I have my feelings on who it's going to be, and I'll tell you that later on. But these are not guys you should be going out of your way to get. These are guys you should be thinking about in the 4th round of your rookie drafts, maybe late 3rd round. I just think the chance of these guys hitting is so low that there's value elsewhere. You're really only considering these guys when you're running out of good options among the running backs or wide receivers. This is basically a desperation pick. And it gets even worse later on. With these bottom 3 guys, the chances of hitting is really low. The only guys I could find since 2010 who hit as 6th or 7th rounders are Darren Waller, and he was drafted as a wide receiver, Ryan Griffin, who had 1 good season and was barely fantasy relevant otherwise, and a whole lot of busts. Now, to be fair, There have been some undrafted free agents who've been successful. Juwan Johnson's been good the last couple of years. You got some blocking guys like Mo Ali Cox who'll catch a pass occasionally. Robert Tonyan had that weird, random top 3 finish and then did nothing otherwise. I think he's now a Viking. He's probably the 4th guy on their depth chart. Taysom Hill's obviously been fantastic, but I don't think we can expect any of these guys to be like Taysom Hill. There is some talent that does come out, but there are hundreds of tight ends on rosters who are undrafted free agents. Each year, there's so many of them around that understanding where the value is and who it's likely to be is low. And most of these guys who are drafted very low down, they don't turn into fantasy relevant players until their 2nd, 3rd, maybe even 4th season. These are guys who have a lot to learn, who have a little bit of upside, which is why teams are willing to take a chance on them. But realistically, their chances of being fantasy relevant while they're on your roster is extremely low. So these are not guys you should be interested in at all. And that has really affected my tight end rookie ranking. So let's get into those. So Brock Bowers is unsurprisingly the number 1. I talked about him earlier. I said you've got to get him early in drafts. This is a guy you want on your rosters. He is going to be spectacular. Where things get interesting for me is where I've ranked 2 and 3, and I really struggled with this. I want to have Jatavian Sanders higher. For me, he's a significantly better player. He's a more talented pass catcher. He's an okay blocker, but he's big enough that I think there's upside there. But he's so good after the catch. He's a good route runner. He's very athletic. He's good in the red zone. I think he's going to be a good fantasy player. It's just hard to know how he fits in that offense. It's a bit confusing because we saw Tommy Tremble struggle there. I feel like this is a bit of a replacement, but they've still got Ian Thomas there. And when they had Tremble, they generally used Ian Thomas as the blocking guy, and then Tremble would be the receiving guy. Neither of them was particularly helpful fantasy-wise. I'm worried that could be the same thing with Sanders, but he does have the talent to be an every down player. And it's not like Thomas is such a good blocker that you can't take him off the field. If Sanders can prove himself as a blocker, I feel like he could become very useful fantasy-wise. If he can't and he's only being used on 3rd downs and in passing situations, he's not a guy you're going to particularly want in fantasy. But the upside's there and the talent's there, and for that reason, I've got him as my 2nd pick. Ben Sinnott is someone I struggled with a lot. The fact that he went into the 2nd round as opposed to all these guys who went in the 4th round is a big plus for me. But I don't like the player at all. There's so many issues with him. He's got drop issues. He's not the best blocker. He's not particularly explosive. He's okay. He's got a little bit of burst and okay top speed, but he's not a guy that's going to burn people off the line by tight end standards. He can line up everywhere, but not particularly effective. He's got blocking upside, but he's going to need to learn it first. So he's not someone who's going to be out there every time early on. And we know that Washington likes to get a lot of their other guys involved. They like John Bates and Cole Turner and those sort of guys out there doing some blocking. So it's not like we can expect him to be an every down tight end straight away. I'm really worried about how he is going to cope in the NFL. I think he might have separation issues. I feel like he might have hands issues. I feel like he's not really big enough or strong enough to make you excited about him. There's a lot of people that are profiling him like some pretty big names. I don't see him that way at all. I see him as a guy who is going to struggle a little bit, and I feel like Washington maybe reached a little bit with this pick. I feel like there are a lot of other options they could have taken, and evidently they could have taken them later on. So that's why I've got Sinnott below Sanders. I think the upside is lower. I do think there's a solid chance he'll at least be their starting tight end for a couple of seasons, and that has more value than a guy who may never be there at all. But realistically, in most leagues, except the deepest of leagues, you want the players who you're going to be able to see as a top 12 tight end. You want that upside. And I don't think that Sinnott has as much upside as Sanders, which is why I have Sanders higher. I have them back-to-back in my dynasty rankings. I believe they're 18 and 19 for me. But that's how you've got to look at them. Sanders is the upside guy. Sinnott is the guy who's more likely to actually be a starter in the NFL, but less likely to be a reliable, good starter in fantasy. There's then a big gap for me down to Eric All Jr., who's a solid player. I liked him in college fantasy. I always like Iowa tight ends. I had 2 Iowa tight ends in my college fantasy team this year. All wasn't the main pass-catching guy, but I feel like there's been a lot of injuries that have gotten in the way, and that's affected him. We know that there's a very open depth chart in Cincinnati when it comes to tight ends. It was mainly Tanner Hudson last season getting a lot of the pass catching work, which was wacky. They used Drew Sample as an H-back. It was meant to be Irv Smith Jr., but he was hardly involved by the end. They had blocking tight ends in there as well. It's a total mess. So it's really difficult to understand how all fits into it. They bring in Mike Gesicki, who's obviously going to be the guy who gets the first chance. But we've seen Mike Gesicki bust already. And he's busted in far easier situations than this Cincinnati depth chart, which is going to be very mixed. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy for all to come in and take the job, but there's at least a path to success there. You could see him being the starter. It's not as an accessible role as some of these other guys, but you can certainly see it happening. And we know that Cincinnati is willing to give a player the every down role if they're good enough. I think All has the talent. I think he has the talent to be that good. We've just actually got to see it. And for that reason, I rank him at 4, but he's a long way behind those top 3. Theo Johnson is not far behind All for me. I also do see a path for him to be fantasy relevant. I don't think he's quite as talented as All. I don't think he's as good a blocker or as good a receiver, but I do think that he has the talent to project into one in the future. The scary thing for the Giants is they might not have anything at tight end this season at all. Darren Waller might retire. He still hasn't reported as far when I recorded this video, he hadn't anyway. So that makes it really scary to know as a Giants fan who's going to be a starting tight end. Daniel Bellinger is clearly not a guy they trusted because they went out and got Waller, and they clearly still don't trust him because they've gone and gotten Theo Johnson as well. I think they believe that Waller might be retiring, and that's why they're thinking of Johnson as a potential backup. They'll certainly use him in conjunction with Bellinger. I expect that Bellinger gets the first go at it, but I can see a situation where Johnson takes over the starting role. I don't think it happens straight away. Most of these guys, I think, are most likely to have success in their second or third season. It's very unusual for a rookie tight end to boom straight away. You have to either be really lucky or really good. I don't know that any of these guys are really good except for Bowers. And we'll just have to wait and see who's lucky. So that's why Johnson goes behind All for me. But I do think there's potential there. I think he's going to develop into a good blocker. He's going to be a big target. I think he'll be good in the red zone. He'll get some touchdowns. People will probably go out of their way to go and get him if he has a good touchdown day and gets a couple of receptions as well. But I think realistically, we're talking about a guy who you're thinking of a couple of years in advance. So for most of these guys, they're probably not even really draftable in most rookie drafts. I think you'd probably be thinking 4th round for All and Johnson. I think everyone else you can probably just leave on waivers unless your rookie drafts go really deep, because then at least it gives you a chance to see what happens in training camp and in rookie camps and everything else, just to see what the news is that comes through around these guys and see if they actually are going to get used more than we expect. Jared Wiley's there as number 6 for me. I've called off a lot on him since Kelsey signed another 2-year contract. I thought it was not impossible that Kelsey just hangs up his boots. It was always going to be unlikely, but I thought it was at least possible that he goes, no, I'm done. Obviously, that's not the case now, probably. So that means that Wiley definitely is more of a backup option. And we've seen the Chiefs do this quite a lot. They brought in Blake Bell, mainly as a backup option. They brought in Noah Gray, mainly as a backup option. They bring in Jared Wiley, mainly as a backup option. I think there's a lot of people talking about Noah Gray as potentially being the guy who they go to after Travis Kelce. I think it's more likely to just go to a committee situation. But there is a chance one of those guys wins the job, Gray or Wiley. And that upside there is why I've got Wiley ranked higher. I think it's unlikely to happen, but it could happen. And for that reason, I'm willing to take a punt on him. Having said that, we're talking 2, 3, 4 years down the track. So the odds of this hitting is very low. This is probably a guy you'll end up dropping for someone else who's going to be more useful in the near future. Unless you're going for a total rebuild in a very deep league, none of these guys from this spot downwards are going to be particularly useful. Speaking of not particularly useful, Tip Ryman, I already talked about this earlier. He's a blocking tight end and not even a particularly good one. I don't really understand what Arizona's doing with this pick. I think they were a better option. I would have preferred Barner, for example, over Ryman as a blocking tight end. He hasn't shown anything as a receiver. Now, to be fair, there have been players who haven't shown anything as a receiver and then turned into solid receiving tight ends, ending up playing every down and being a little bit fantasy relevant. That's why I've got him at number 7. I've moved him past Bell based on the fact that Bell is a 7th round pick, and that scared me off looking at the numbers. Ryman, I think, is probably a guy that you would only consider if you're in a deep league, you've got deep drafts, maybe drafting into the 5th and 6th rounds. In that case, I'd consider taking him. and just see how he's getting used, see how he's getting used in training camp, and see if Trey McBride gets some random injury at training camp. If we get a bad Trey McBride injury, all of a sudden, Tip Ryman probably going to have a little bit of value, even though I don't think he's necessarily going to be the starter. He at least increases in value, and then maybe he's someone you can trade or just see what happens. Cade Stover's another guy who's wedged well down the depth chart. It's a really awkward depth chart in Houston. You've already got Dalton Schultz as the main tight end there, and then you've got a heap of guys behind him. Kitoriano's the main blocking guy, but there's a lot of other guys around. Obviously, Brevin Jordan's a solid receiving back, tight end. So I don't know that you can really do much with Cade Stover. There are a lot of people who really liked him going into the draft, but at best here, he's a backup. And that's at best. I think there's a situation where he's barely used and ends up on the practice squad or very low down as a special teams guy. I don't really see a clear path to touches without a Dalton Schultz injury. And then if a Schultz injury happens, I still don't really think it's an obvious path. I think it's still going to be a messy committee and maybe he's not even involved at all. So I don't feel great about Stover. You're going to be thinking 2, 3, 4 years down the track and hoping something happens if you draft him. Ninth pick is Jaheim Bell. I really liked him going into the draft. I thought he was a potential third round pick. Little bit surprised he dropped into the 7th round. Still waiting to hear back from Charlie Campbell in his Why the Slide series as to why Bell fell that low. I feel like it's probably that his blocking is a little bit weak. He's a little bit small. He's a good receiving back, but I don't think he's really going to be able to play every down in the NFL. It may be that he can't play any downs because his receiving work's just not as good as guys who are just essentially receivers. And it makes more sense to use them here. He might end up as just a special teams guy. Having said that, I do think there's a potential that he's there as a receiving back. They're eventually going to have to move on from Hunter Henry. We've seen that they're willing to take a receiving heavy back with Mike Gesicki recently. So it's possible they see him as someone shifting into that Gesicki role as the receiving back in that tight end room. I think it's unlikely. I think it's very unlikely. We saw with the numbers before what happens with receiving tight ends, especially late round guys. But I at least have to consider that when putting him in the rankings. And finally, I moved AJ Barner from 12 up to 10 because he's a 4th round guy and I don't like the 7th round guys because of the obvious with the numbers. I think Barner's probably a blocking tight end, same with Tip Ryman. I think he's actually a better player than Ryman is. I think the only consideration is that Seattle in the past has used a big rotation with their tight end. So it is possible he's coming in to take that Will Disley role of being mostly a blocking guy, but you're still going to run some routes. That's not particularly valuable. It's not like you've ever particularly wanted Will Disley on your fantasy roster. You barely want Noah Fant. So I can't see a situation where you're wanting AJ Barner, but we've been wrong about how teams are planning on using tight ends before. The fact that someone's always been a blocking tight end doesn't mean they're always going to be a blocking tight end in the future. It might be that a team believes that they can turn him into a receiving tight end and plans on doing that. That usually takes a little bit of time. So you're really only taking guys like Barner, guys like Ryman, if you're willing to be patient and wait. But then again, Noah Fant gets an injury. Barner is the natural guy who probably comes in and takes over with a significant role there because it's really only Pharaoh Brown as the other guy. And while he is a receiving tight end, Barner probably takes a lot of the early down snaps if Fant goes down. You'd have to think they go in and get a free agent tight end if that happens, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. Not much else to talk about with the tight ends. So that's us done for today. Thanks for joining me. Make sure, if you haven't already, like and subscribe. Also, make sure you check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and go to our website, ffdfantasyfootball.com, to check out all my rankings, articles, and everything else. Make sure you leave a comment down below if you have any questions or hit me up on Twitter and Instagram. I'll answer them all there. I will be back very soon with more fantasy football contents.